Good morning to those joining us online. Welcome back to the second day of the third weekend for the Dublin Citizens Assembly live here in the Grand Hotel in beautiful North County Dublin in Malahide. This morning we are going to do our plenary feedback session with Dr. Theresa Reidy, who spoke to us yesterday on local government finance. And we have some questions that you want to pose to Dr. Reidy. We're going to have a session with some chambers of commerce, and then we'll hand it back to you to discuss lessons learned so far. Just to start the morning off, back to our terms of reference, some discussions last night around that, and it's good to know that we're on track in terms of holding to the terms of reference. Just to remind ourselves that this Citizens Assembly, which is known as our Dublin's Citizens Assembly, shall be convened to consider the type of directly elected mayor and local government structures that are best suited to Dublin and to bring forward proposals in that regard. I think we all agree, well certainly the consensus was, that I was picking up last night, is that we're moving towards that. Bit of work to be done yet, but we're moving in the right direction as we pass the halfway post in our aim to have our report into the Oireachtas by November. So if you look at the stages that we're through, we're on stage, the third stage. Yesterday we had the devolution of powers discussion, which created some stimulus, some tension, but I look at it as creative tension. Got people thinking about why we're here, and we're very purposeful in terms of our intent and why we're here to do a job on behalf of the citizens of Dublin City and County. We spoke with the finance bit that we're going to wash up very shortly. We have the commerce piece I mentioned, and then what have you learned so far? We'll, as we mentioned yesterday and again last evening, we are beginning to solidify our thoughts on the 10th of September. I'll come back to that in my closing remarks, and then we're going to get a report in by November. So to start the proceedings, we're going to welcome again, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Theresa Reidy, who is with us on stage to answer your questions. So the facilitators have given us the questions. We have quite a number to get through. We have approximately a half an hour to do that. And the first question is from table 4, please, and Kieran. It was about evidence-based research. We go to the table, okay. All right, we'll stay with number 4, please. And Kieran, your question on your evidence-based research. Thank you.
Hi, Kieran, table 4. From the evidence-based research, could you give us the different options of raising money at local government to us for consideration?
All right, thanks, Kieran. I suppose the first thing to say is that we actually now have most of the major components of a revenue base for local government funding that's quite similar to other European countries. The big gap in our funding base was the local property tax, and that came in first as the household charge and then evolved into the local property tax. So that was actually the one major component that was missing in our revenue base. And so now we're actually broadly in line in terms of the different components we have. Where we're still, I suppose, different to other European countries is in the rates that we levy. So in particular, the amount of money we raise from the local property tax is really, really small in comparison to other European countries. So yesterday I was showing you it's about kind of 7% of total revenue for local authorities comes in from local property tax. You know, in a lot of other European countries, that would be heading upwards towards about 25%. And it's probably worth knowing that the amounts that people pay in property tax annually in this country are what you would pay monthly in quite a number of other European countries. That would be at the upper end now, okay, so that's a spectrum. So we're on one end of the spectrum where it's really quite low, and the higher ends of the spectrum, which would be some of the Nordic countries, but Germany, France, for example, all have quite high levels of local property tax. So I don't know, many of your property owners, but think about how much you pay a year and think about paying that every month. Now, of course, you don't have to connect that to services and to the kind of, that's very important. It's not like the property tax would go up for no reason. It would map onto additional service delivery. But in terms of a comparative European examination, looking at where do our local authorities get their money from, well, actually we have most of the major components that are the same as other European countries, but we just happen to levy particularly property tax at a lower rate. If we go beyond Europe, in particular, there are kind of tax sharing or tax splitting arrangements that you find in other countries, other jurisdictions. You get local sales taxes, local purchase taxes. That's particularly common in the United States. Any of you who have been to the States, you go to the counter to buy something and suddenly an extra 8 or 9% gets added to the total. That's usually a state tax or a local tax that is applied. Now, of course, we already have a quite high VAT, so there probably isn't much scope to be adding local sales or property taxes. But there are also local business taxes that you could get as well. But again, I'm not sure how much political appetite there would be for those, but the one real thing where we stand out would be increasing the property tax. But I do appreciate for the political people in the room that that's not an entirely popular thing to be knocking on doors trying to sell.
Thanks, Table 4 and Kieran, for that question. The Ear Taoiseach, Mr. Bertie Hearn, yesterday mentioned or referenced a hotel bed tax, and Table 10 and Ruth have a similar question.
Good morning. My name is Ruth from Table 10. My question goes this: what is the rate of tourist tax in similar cities around the EU countries compared to Dublin?
So that's a good question. It varies quite a lot. I mean, the ones that I would know a little bit about, Venice has a tourist tax that varies by season. So in low season, I think it's like €1 or €2, and then in high season, it goes up to €5 a night. And a couple of German cities, for example, they have tourist taxes which tend not to vary by season, but they're somewhere around kind of €2 to €3 a night. And the interesting thing about them is that they're quite efficient from a government point of view, because the actual collection, of course, is done by the hotel. So the hotel just adds it onto your bill, and then it makes a return at the end of the tax year. So it doesn't require kind of extensive administrative structures that you might have to have with other taxes. You effectively transfer the burden of collection onto the hotels. So it varies quite a bit. They're not without controversy, though, and that's the reason I give you the Venice one. There's quite a bit of controversy about the Venice property tax, and it ties into lots of debates about the kind of structure of tourism in Venice, but also where the revenues go. In some countries as well, it's probably worth mentioning that the tourist tax is often connected to service benefits for tourists. So for example, in some of the German cities, if you pay the tourist tax, you usually get free public transport in the city transport system. So you pay your €3 a day, but then you get a little docket that allows you to access the public transport system for free. So there's kind of an advantage built into the tourist tax. So in terms of thinking about it, you could think about a whole variety of different ways. Who would pay it, how much they would pay, where the revenues would be retained, but then as well whether there would be any kind of inducement or positive benefit for tourists who are staying in the area.
Ruth, and thanks, Ruth, and Table 10 for that question. Now we move to Table 8, please, and Mary.
Yeah, I think the question has been answered, actually. We were just looking at Finland and the graph that you gave yesterday. The taxes and the salaries that they pay are obviously much higher there. So we were wondering, when you're looking at Dublin, what would you suggest is a workable alternative to raising funds?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the property tax is kind of the obvious answer there, but it's also worth saying that the Finnish government centrally also gives more money to their local authorities. So they actually transfer money to the local authorities, and then the local authorities use that money to deliver services at the local level. I think in one of the presentations they were going through some of the examples of the really concrete educational and welfare services that are delivered by the local authorities. So some of that is paid for locally, but quite a bit of it is also transferred from central government. So, yeah, that would probably be one of the options.
Okay, thank you for that. Table 2, you have 3 questions there from Leslie. 4 questions from Killian, from Shane. You might just have a quick chat there. Which one you'd like to ask? Francis as well. You had a question as well.
Francis also.
Thank you.
Hi,
Francis from Table 2. I'm interested if Dr. Reedy believes that it would be a good idea to disband the 4 councils, from a finance perspective, to work under a newly elected, directly elected mayor. Would it simplify the financing aspect?
I think that would take me a little bit beyond my expertise now, because disbanding, I presume you mean amalgamating 4 local authorities,
or changing the structure, given that Dublin City Council is quite large, and then the other 3 councils are smaller, and would it simplify the budgeting and the financial work?
Yeah. So, I think you'd probably want to have reasons for why you would amalgamate local authorities beyond pure finance, to be honest, because you'd be creating a huge local authority. So I think that takes us kind of beyond the finance conversation, to be honest. That's a bigger decision than just finances.
So otherwise the directly elected mayor would have to, work with all 4 councils, so it would complicate the mayor's role.
I see what you're saying, but I suppose that's a structural matter, and it's probably for yourselves to decide in terms of your final recommendations about whether you want to, integrate the 4 local authorities, or you could create a regional tier of governance above the 4 local authorities and then put the mayor on top of that. There are a variety of different models, but I suppose that kind of from a financial point of view, what you want, if you want a powerful directly elected mayor, is that there has to be some mapping of the financial powers to the mayor. What happens at the lower level, I think, is a question of structure and what's the most efficient kind of structure. But efficiency in local government is not always bigger. That's, I think, important to keep in mind because of what I was kind of showing you yesterday. Local authorities do different things. So amalgamating different local authorities doesn't necessarily make the service delivery more efficient. So those are quite large questions, and I'm not sure finance alone could give you a final decision,
We now move to table 11, and we had 3 questions, one from Jason, a question from Kriya, and we had a question from James on offsetting taxes. So do you want to do a quick little debate there and come up with what's the best question, having listened to some of the questions already?
Yeah. Thanks, this is Jason from table 11. So question is in relation to funding and local autonomy, local authority autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
And, is there any potential for community funding amongst the citizens and local authorities to fund or help fund major projects within Dublin? Or, perhaps is there any international examples where this is already in place?
Sorry, can I ask, what do you mean by community funding?
Well, I guess this would be, in this case, direct involvement of citizens funding into infrastructure projects or other projects, as opposed to just taxation, but directly funding and buying into particular projects.
Maybe like crowdsourcing or something like
exactly,
that? Okay.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. In principle, there's no reason why you couldn't crowdsource funding for a piece of infrastructure, but infrastructure is very expensive. So, I mean, you could envisage a scenario where a community does local funding to support a particular amenity in their area. In fact, most of our communities are doing that all the time. They're funding their tidy towns committees and all kinds of local initiatives. So they run lots of local things on the ground, raffles and draws and table quizzes to fund kind of smaller pieces of development. So, I mean, I think we already probably have quite active communities in Ireland and a lot of activity happening on the ground in that area. And actually local authorities support a lot of that work. They come in on the side, but in terms of larger projects, I mean, I think there would be barriers. But it is worth mentioning, though, a tool that is associated with Brazil, actually, and that's participatory budgeting. And I don't know if you've been discussing that at any stage. And that's actually a form of decision-making that's in the same kind of family of decision-making as citizens' assembly. So it's a kind of a tool of deliberative democracy. And quite a number of local authorities have been using it. It's being used quite widely, actually, in Scotland. And that's where you bring in groups of citizens together and they're allocated a pool of money, or there's a decision to be made about a pool of money and how it might be spent. And the citizens adjudicate on what the best way of spending that money is. Is it a park or is it a bridge? And it's been particularly successful in Scotland for engaging young people. So, for example, they convene these participatory budgeting events and they bring in representatives from, the young Scots and they adjudicate, should it be on a skateboard park or should it be, some other piece of infrastructure for young people. And the citizens take that decision. So it's structured within the local authority, but it's direct involvement in citizens in making budgetary decisions. So that's also something else. We haven't been doing as much of that, but there's certainly been some experiments in it, but there would be a role for more of that, for example.
Thanks, Teresa. Participative budgeting. Would we call that subsidiarity? Is that what the academics would call it? Pushing that autonomy down? No?
Definitely going on the right line.
On the right direction. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. Building on the theme from yesterday, transport in the city in County of Dublin. Question from table 12, please, and Monica.
Hello. Would you consider putting in place a congestion charge comparative to London? That's currently £15 a day to drive into a congested area. It's a fine of £180 or £160 if you don't pay it. It's £80 if you pay it within 14 days. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I think Teresa's opinion on a congestion charge doesn't really matter. But the question is more to put it back to you to say, should the directly elected mayor in Dublin have the power to introduce a congestion charge if they feel that that's a valuable thing to do for the city? So what kind of financial powers do you want to have the directly elected mayor to have? And that's exactly the kind of powers that directly elected mayors have in other places. Anne Hidalgo in Paris has used similar tools, particularly in relation to her cycling initiative. So it's more a case of, when you think about the powers that you want to give to the mayor, do you want them to be quite extensive? With them having real capacity to both raise money but also alter behaviour. And that's a really good example of a novel charge. So, because somebody asked this morning what other kinds of things you do, there's lots of small user charge type changes you could introduce that could be quite effective. We already do lots of those. We already charge for parking and we charge for lots of things to either encourage or discourage types of behaviour. So there's a whole suite of measures that could potentially be available to the Dublin mayor. And the question is whether you think they should or shouldn't have those.
That's very thought-provoking. It's in your hands, Assembly members. We had 5 from question table 3, so I better go to table 3. If you want to have a little moment to decide which of those 5 questions is most relevant at this particular point of the discussion. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Reedy. So a question from table 3 is, it was our perception that rates are harder to collect from a local authority than they are from a centralised government, as in people don't necessarily are slower to pay their bin charges or rent to a local authority than they are to revenue, for example, because there might be, I guess, more fines or, coming from revenue. So do you think that local authorities, or how would local authorities enforce collection of payments if they had more payments to collect?
I'm not sure I have any kind of real pearls of wisdom there, other than to confirm what you're saying in relation to commercial rates, that they are difficult to collect. I'd add that they're also complicated, that the way in which the commercial rate is composed, it's on the kind of rateable value of the property, so you have commissioners' evaluation, and you've quite elaborate procedures to actually get to the commercial rate. So it's quite a complex process to get there. Well, I think it's probably worth saying that revenue, of course, are very effective at what they do. Revenue will find you. But it's also the case that, you know, some businesses, it's not as clear cut in terms of their ability to pay always. So some of it, there's always a gap between the amount of money a local authority thinks it's going to get in, and there's kind of the bad debts commercial rates. But it's not simply straightforward that it's companies that refuse to pay. Sometimes they can't pay, and that's part of the composition. And having revenue collected wouldn't necessarily change that arrangement. And there's also variation. Some local authorities are more effective than other local authorities at managing that. So there are probably administrative learnings that could be shared among the local authorities. But I mean, bin charges is an interesting one. I mean, they're largely privatised across the country now, and it's private companies and all the different local authorities, and they'll still tell you they find it a little bit difficult to collect the bin charges. So there's no easy solutions to those kinds of things, but they could certainly improve some of their procedures, learn from other local authorities. But I don't think there's transferring the collection of commercial rates to revenue, for example. It kind of goes against the spirit of devolution and the spirit of companies actually paying at the level at which they receive the services. So it's kind of not in line with, I suppose, best practice in terms of thinking about local government finance.
Table 7, Sophie, this question might have been answered, but if you'd like maybe to pose the question, if you believe it hasn't been.
Sophie, table 7. If there was a devolution of powers to a directly elected mayor, would the funding follow this devolution from central government? Would that represent a burden rather than a benefit?
I mean, this is one where I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask it back of you, because this is a really unusual moment in the evolution of local government, where you have, like, looking at the terms of reference, almost being given a blank sheet to define what the directly elected mayor would do. So in terms of the financial procedures, I mean, there's certainly the way the question is framed to you, there's a lot of scope for you to talk about how the mayor should be funded and what financial powers that mayor should have. So, I mean, things that you might want to think about are who should lead the budgetary discussions when or if a directly elected mayor is in place. So at the moment, it's the chief executive within the local authority who really does most of the budgetary work. I mean, it's the councillors that decide, but it's the chief executive and their team that, you know, starts the discussions, sets out the figures, looks at the parameters. And that's where the real power is, because when you come in after a draft budget has been done, even if you don't agree with it, you're trying to unpick it. The power is in putting the budget together. So one of the questions is, who should have that power? Should that power be with the directly elected mayor? And then I think it's quite complex, because it comes back to your question, Francis, which is how should that power, where should that power sit in relation to the other local authorities? So would they have their own budgetary processes? Would you create a new budgetary process for the directly elected mayor? Would there be revenue sharing between the mayor and the 4 local authorities? And these are questions to which, unfortunately, there aren't any kind of particularly easy answers, but you have this wonderful opportunity to actually assess this and make those kinds of decisions. So there aren't answers that I can give you, but these are the right questions to be asking. But it's essentially, it's up to yourselves. And the second part of your question was, if you devolve, would money follow the role? I mean, money has to follow the role, otherwise it's not meaningful. So finances are inherently built into this. There's really little point in creating a directly elected mayor unless they have some budget that's flowing in their direction, and unless they have some capacity to determine where that budget goes. The question is how big that budget is, and where the money comes from, and then in particular how it relates to these other tiers of government. But there are lots of models, Paris, Rome, Manchester I know you heard from, and a lot of them operate quite similarly actually.
Some great questions, and I'm going to continue on. I'll ease into my own time at the very end. So we got 3 tables to go, and then I think we'll have gone to each table that posed questions. So it'll be in this order. Table 6, you have 2 questions. You might just consider which one you'd like to ask. Then we go to table 2. You also had 2 questions, and you might consider which is the best. And then table 1, you had 4. So please consider which is the best question to ask. So 6, 5, and 1. And again, thanks again to Dr. Reedy for her time.
Hi, it's Paula for table 3. So our question is, what are the reasons for us raising only 3% of revenue on a local level? And are there constraints by central government on that?
The answer is yes and yes. So there are constraints on the revenue that can be raised by local authorities from the local property tax. There's a national system of valuation which has just been gone through in the past year, and local authorities there's a set rate nationally for the local property tax, and local authorities can vary that rate up and down within quite a narrow margin. So if a local authority wanted to engage in some major new initiative, they don't have the power at present to come in and double the rate of property tax. They can only increase it up by 0.15. I defer to a councillor in the room for the exact amount, but they're quite restricted in terms of how much they can raise in the revenue. So that's why if you were going to increase the property tax, that would require a significant decision of the government to change that, to free up the local authorities to be able to raise the revenue more extensively. But it comes back to that other question that I was asked earlier. There's primary legislation coming for the directly elected mayor, can't be created without it. So you could make a recommendation that allowed the directly elected mayor to have more scope to vary the rate of property tax. That could be something you could put in, but it would have to be done through primary legislation. Yeah.
So it's table 5, table 1, and then table 9, you had 2 questions as well. So 5, 1, and 9, that'll conclude the questions.
Nicole, table 1. Our question was, if local government was to take back responsibility for services, would the money that they raise go back to the locality? So like, for example, say motor tax used to be collected locally. If they were to take back responsibility, should that money follow suit? And I suppose, or would it stay in the centralised manner where it's distributed to them? And is it realistic that the funding could be reallocated locally? And I suppose just hearing from everybody else saying as well, do you think there would be more buy-in and councillors would be willing to up things like property tax if they knew the full amount was going to stay locally?
The first thing I'll tell you is that there is a change coming in the local property tax. So at the moment you have that equalisation mechanism in place, where kind of better off local authorities subsidise less well-off local authorities, and that's due to be phased out from next year onwards. So there's a change coming in the structures. So local property tax, then all of the revenue is going to stay in the local authority area. So it'll be interesting to see when that happens, particularly for the Dublin local authorities, whether that changes the incentive structures that the councillors have in terms of raising extra revenue. If they know all of that revenue will stay in their local area, well, then maybe it changes the incentive structure. So that might be useful for you to be aware of. The other question you ask is a slightly it's slightly more difficult, I suppose. I mean, if the government devolves powers to local authorities, the money will have to follow the function, if you want. There's no point devolving responsibilities and roles to local authorities without actually giving the financing to deliver those particular roles. The question is, which roles would those be, and whether the money would continue to be collected centrally and devolved through that central fund down to local authorities, or whether the government might decide, actually, we want it paid for at local level, so we're going to change the structure of local financing and allow local authorities to raise more revenue at local level. So there are different ways they could do it. And it'd really be kind of a function of whoever is in government and what they decided would be the best way of proceeding with it. I mean, effectively, the government has all the power when it comes to all of this, so it would be a decision of the minister responsible. But if they were, say, we had very interesting talk yesterday on childcare, if they were to devolve all childcare response, I mean, there are lines of revenue funding childcare already as it stands. So you'd have to imagine that they would have to devolve in some way to local level to support the provision of that service if it was going to become more extensive at local level. But how they would do it would very much be, for open debate and discussion, and ultimately at the discretion or the determination of the government.
Thanks, Nicole, on table 5. Now, table 1 and then table 9. Thank you.
Karen from Table.
Hi, Karen.
If the directly elected mayor had the power to raise taxation, what are the restrictions and limits that they would have in doing so?
Right, thank you. They would be whatever the government determine. I'm sorry, I'm giving really answers that are well, it depends on the government, but ultimately it really would depend on how the government actually sets it up. So you could imagine a scenario, say for example, if you all recommend that the directly elected mayor should have a role in the setting of the local property tax. There probably would be parameters put on that, in the same way that there are parameters put on the property tax at present. The government does the national valuation, and local authorities can vary the rate at which it's levied, but within quite a narrow frame. If it was a directly elected mayor, I mean, your group could recommend that that spectrum could be either widened very considerably. You might decide it should be narrowed very considerably, that they shouldn't have the power, or you could say that there should be no limit at all on the directly elected mayor. So it would rather depend on how you go back to the government. It would be up to them, and it would be in the legislation as to how the rate would actually, how the property or tax or the commercial rates or any of the other services. The question is whether the mayor should be in charge of those things, and to what extent they would be in charge of those things. And I guess it will eventually be a case of your recommendations, discussion in the department, and we see what finally gets into the legislation. Yes, but it's not independent of your deliberations. You know, I mean, you have the capacity to really shape that and make recommendations, but ultimately it would go to the department and the minister, and they would make an adjudication, and of course it'd have to be passed in the Dáil, so it would have to have democratic support. Yeah.
Thanks, Karen, on table 1 for that question. And finally, table 9.
Good morning, Dr. Reedy. James is my name, and I think our table found this a really interesting discussion, so thanks a million. I think most of our stuff has been touched on already, but we did have a quick question in relation to the funding provided to the local governments from Central. I think we've heard a lot about there being kind of strings and conditions attached to it, and we wondered whether you have seen examples where the money is just the money is given to local government and the power to decide where it gets divested sits locally as opposed to centrally.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, it comes in different ways. Like there's a general allocation, and then there are specific allocations. But the local authorities, the money doesn't go into a local authority from the general allocation to go to particular types of things. You know, local authorities have to pay for salaries, they have to pay for services. So there's a general amount that comes from central government that goes into the pot that the local authority has, along with their local property tax revenues, the money they raise from service charges, and that pays for everything they do. But they do get a lot of kind of earmarked grants, kind of specific purpose grants for varieties of different things, initiatives that are happening. So it might be the expansion of the library, and the money comes perhaps for on the capital side here now for building, and they've applied, they get money, and then that money comes. And they generally have to build a library. They can't go back and say, well, you know, oops, but we actually decided 2 roundabouts on the main road were a better use of it. Like, so that's the kind of thing. When I'm talking about specific funding, it's usually quite, you know, the subject of elaborate and long discussions, and it comes for providing very specific types of infrastructure, or it might be specific types of initiatives. For example, during COVID, there was quite a bit of money channeled through the local authorities to go out into the community to do a variety of different things. At the moment, local authorities are receiving a lot of dedicated funding for cycling infrastructure, for example. So that's coming from central government, and it's specifically for cycling infrastructure. That's how it's actually used in the local authorities. In the kind of research literature on local government financing, there's generally a criticism made of Ireland that too much of the money that comes from central government comes for those kinds of specific grants, and actually that they should receive much more money in the kind of general pot. So that they would have more discretion in terms of how to spend it. And that was one of the points I was making yesterday, that when you go down through the budget line by line, at the end of the day, the kind of discretionary part that local councillors get to kind of adjudicate on is actually a relatively small pool of money, because a lot of it has already been factored into the, you know, spending obligations of the local authorities.
Well, Dr. Reedy, thank you so much for that. It's been a very engaging session for our opening part of Sunday morning. My key takeaways, as you said, the Tonol Saronach, the free citizens have that free capacity and that capacity to shape this in whatever way you deem appropriate. So it's been very good, a very good session. Thank you so much for your time, and safe journey home. And give a warm thank you to Dr. Theresa Reedy. Gur mágat. So now we move on to our second part of the morning, and we're going to have some presentations on a topic called a democratically elected mayor, a view from the business community. And it's a great privilege this morning that we have from the Dublin Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Avrik McGibney, Director of Public and International Affairs, and also from Chambers Ireland, Mr. Shane Keneally, Director of Policy and Communications. So please give a warm Dublin City Assembly for our first presenter, Mr. Avrik McGibney.
Okay, hi, good morning everyone. Avrik is my name. Avrik McGibney. My name comes from a 1960s version of The Children of Lear, and I turned swans into princesses. That worked pretty well in my 20s. It probably doesn't work as well now. I was born in St. Michael's in Dunleary. My parents are both from Inchicore. My dad now lives in Lucan. I now live in, you know, you kind of buy where you think you might. I'm lucky enough to live near where you kind of grow up, so I live near the Slorgan Shopping Centre, which I remember fondly as a child. And that's my life. It's all over Dublin, you know. I work in the city centre, but, you know, my dad lives in one place, I live in somewhere else. So, you know, I think businesses also have a similar perspective about Dublin. You don't set up a shop saying, I'm only going to sell to the people, you know, on the street outside. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a Kilkenny design in the, you know, Silorgan shopping centre as well as the city centre. You don't set up a business thinking, well, I'll only hire people who live a kilometre away, you know, in terms of where you're going to get your skilled staff. So businesses also think about Dublin as a unit, if you like. I'm going to offer you some perspectives on Dublin, because I was hoping to have a more fully formed discussion. We're still having a debate internally within Dublin Chamber about, you know, our final thoughts, and we will hopefully make a submission in the next few weeks. But Art got me in, he got me ahead of time. So I'm going to offer you some thoughts and some perspectives, if that's okay. All right? First up, just a little bit about what chambers do, I suppose, just to kind of give you an idea. Dublin Chamber was founded in 1783. It's one of the oldest chambers in the world. We have 1,300 member companies which employ themselves about 300,000 staff. And the breakdown of that membership is across the county of Dublin, pretty much reflecting the breakdown of commercial rates in the 4 local authorities, which I'll come to later. So my current president, for example, is the head of Dublin Airport. My last one was, they're elected every year. They're kind of the governor or the chief, the president for a year. Is from the city centre. She's the head of business banking in AIB. The previous person was out in Sandyford. So again, you know, from all over Dublin, okay? We're brought together. I mean, the reason people join Dublin Chamber is we have a shared vision for Dublin to be sustainable, to be have good quality of life, and to be known for its economic vibrancy. So these are the criteria that drag us together. I put up a slide there, or a graphic of, we asked about 10 to 15,000 people, citizens of Dublin, what they thought of Dublin. And I'll send that on actually to Art just to give you an idea. It's a bit old now, it's from 2016, 2017, but it gives you some perspective about what people thought they would like Dublin to be in 2050, which is kind of maybe some information, and it's from, as I say, an unbiased, it's a random sample of people. So what does the Chamber actually do? We help companies export. We provide business matching services. So if you want to go to Poland to export, we'll find you somebody in Poland who can talk to you about doing that. We do export documentation, which is the pieces of paper you need to bring something abroad. We do a lot of networking and events which companies meet and kind of get together, a bit like you guys, and get to know each other and do business. We do a lot of training and kind of knowledge-based events, so we have people speaking about, for example, this is how I ran my business, this is how I grew it, to inspire people, those kinds of things. And we also do lobbying, which is the dirty word in the room, but it's very much usually about, because a city doesn't function without it being, without it working, a lot of that lobbying is about long-run transport infrastructure for the city, about having enough water, because we don't want any more water shortages, so we have to take water from the Shannon in order to do that, so that'll be interesting, and about, say, energy as an issue. And the key issue, because they all join together, is about affordable housing. So that's the main lobbying points that the Chamber talks about. So what's Dublin? Well, that's interesting. So Dublin was divided as a county into 4 administrative areas. I think because it got too big, and that's a recurring theme. But I know, Jim, they didn't divide up Dublin in any other way, for example, in terms of GAA, for example. Interestingly, when COVID was around, after the 2 kilometre bit, we all remember the 2 kilometres and the 5, and you know, it was a county of Dublin that became the area you could move around. So I nearly broke that trying to get out to buy a Christmas tree, because I nearly went across the border into Wicklow. But you kind of forget, but it was the county of Dublin, because how could you divide, you know, when does it become Lucan and then it becomes, you know, outside of Lucan into somewhere else? There is a metropolitan area strategic plan for most of Dublin, and it's all about integrated transport and land use, which is a key function, because basically cities are about where people live, where they go to do things like recreation and go to school and stuff, and where they go to work. So those key functions are really, really important. So that already exists, but it's in another structure that we might come to. And yet, you know, the recent collaboration between Dublin City Council and South Dublin is it's a great new idea, a brownfield site to convert to residential, but it's a stone's throw from Bluebell, where my dad used to cycle into the city centre, and it's called City's Edge, which kind of gives you an idea sometimes of the thinking. The City's Edge isn't Bluebell, you know. It's not even the Red Cow, you know. So when businesses talk about Dublin, they talk about, I'm going to say, the functional area of the city. So if you're in Dún Laoghaire, you wrote down, you do need to worry about Dublin Airport, because that's where you fly out of, you're going on holidays, but it's also the connection from a business point of view to your markets and things like that. And you worry about the port for similar reasons. And you think about Dublin in terms of 3, if not 4 universities with TU Dublin, for example. And you probably might include Maynooth as well, because they're all a source of people who might be trained graduates that you'd want to work. So you think about Dublin definitely as a county, and if not, probably even something even a bit bigger. So we think about the functional area of the city. Now I'm an economist by trade, so I'm going to give you some stats, and all of these will make some sense at the end, so just ask you to bear with me. But Dublin, if anything, Dublin is small by international standards. Dublin barely makes the rankings sometimes when you look at OECD or other city rankings. And yet, it's a huge part of Ireland. So Dublin isn't a particularly big city internationally. It's not a particularly big capital city. But Ireland, either Dublin is too big for Ireland or Ireland is too small for Dublin, but it's just a huge part. Sorry, I skipped ahead of my slides. So the latest census has it at 1.4 million people, but the figures I have I didn't get a chance to update them. But it's pretty much nearly half of all the urban population of Ireland, okay? Employment is recorded by where people live, not by where they work, right? So you have 768,000 people that are reported according to the CSO figures. The CSO then asked them, well, where do you go to work? And that's 905,000 people. So 905,000 people work in Dublin, okay? Even though they could be in Kildare, they could be in Naas, they could be in Bray, they could be wherever. 40% of all gross value added, which for you and me is GDP. So 40% of all the stuff that's made, produced and done is from Dublin. Half of all tax revenue, nearly 2/3 of all corporate tax revenue, and corporate tax revenue is a quarter of all exchequer revenue these days because of very high corporation tax receipts. So there's a lot of money in Dublin, right? And we'd love to get our hands on all of that. Wouldn't it be great? So as I say, Dublin's pretty big. Most of my arguments are going to be around, and what the Chamber would have been arguing would have been about aggregation, not devolution, okay? So there is another process that's you've seen Tim talking about, which is about county level or local authority level devolution. It tends to be a debate about a chief executive having powers and a mayor having powers, the responsibility between the two. And you've seen what's going on with Limerick, basically. And I imagine what will happen in Limerick is something that will be replicated in other counties if they choose to have an election for a directly elected mayor. But we've long form in this. I think of, for example, when Minister Gormley was looking to introduce the idea of a directly elected mayor, but the powers were very, very light. If you look back at the legislation, they were about sort of moral suasion, if anything else. So in other words, we'll set up a figure, but they won't be able to do very much. They'll just be somebody who, by their election, will actually be important. Most of the argument is about increased aggregation, if you like. We notice, if you look at the trend of what's happening in terms of local authorities and the powers and the relationship between national government, if anything, there's an increasing trend towards aggregation of powers, powers going from local to national or regional rather than the other way around, okay? So we nearly had a Dublin Transport Authority to deal with all the transport of Dublin. It's got most of the buses and all that other stuff. But at the last minute, it was trained into a National Transport Authority that has a specific remit for Dublin. You've seen water going from local authorities to a national body. You've seen planning going now. There's a hierarchy. The Minister for Housing sets things then that have to be obeyed by regional authorities, that have to be obeyed down to local authorities. So there's a hierarchy all the way through. There's a planning regulator, again, also, that if a local authority says we're going to zone it one way, but it's not in the national interest, the planning regulator will come in. Also, for example, we've seen trends in terms of taxation, for example. There's a vacant site levy, so if there's underutilised land, somebody should be taxing it to make sure it's utilised if it's not being used. That power has gone to revenue, which we just heard, of course. There's death and taxes, but there's death and revenue, really, I think, in terms of who's got the power. There's a trend towards this. I think I observe there is a trend towards this, particularly when we're talking about devolution. The last 10 years shows you otherwise, okay? I've little to say on the structure. I really do, because business people aren't really experts on structure. Usually the argument for a mayor was about setting somebody on top to drive efficiencies between the 4 local authorities. So you have 4 payroll systems, 4 IT systems. Can we have it better? Not to take away the power at local level, but to save money. And you'll see why in a minute. And I put up here the powers that Limerick have proposed in their proposal. So that's the bit that's going through this debate about whether, it'll chasing the legislation. A lot of it is about carving out a seat at the table and having representation into national government, really. It's about saying, make somebody important enough in Limerick that they'll get a chance to talk about the big issues, the health, education, housing, things like that. That's what I read into that. I'll leave the slides, obviously, they'll be available to you afterwards, so I'm rushing through this. And in many ways, there's an argument for this. There are 45 Dublin TDs, but they don't really behave in many ways as a unit. There's much smaller cities that do much better, where there's a smaller number of TDs, but they argue for the region a lot better. 45 TDs argue for 45 different regions and constituencies within Dublin, so Dublin is very divided. So always chase the money. I'm racing towards the end here, sorry, I'm conscious of time. This is the level of commercial rates funding in value terms and as a percentage of total funding for the 4 local authorities in Dublin. Dublin City Council, despite the number being quite big, it's a smaller ratio because there's a lot more money in, money out stuff we just heard. A lot of intergovernmental transfers that are earmarked for particular things. But in general, businesses in commercial rates alone fund a good half of all local government, and they've no idea where that money is spent. Nobody comes back and says, here, this is where it goes. The big fear for many businesses would be, it'll be another tax, a hotel bed tax. Let's add more taxes. Let's make, businesses don't vote, so it'd be great if we had more taxes on business. That's what they worry about when you talk about having local funding. Collection, as we've seen, seems to go to revenue because they're very good at it and they know where you live and they'll get you when you die. And, these are well debated with me, but there's a, the worry from a local business point of view is be looking for a hotel bed tax. That's the simple version, or something else. This is just another survey. You can't read it, and that's deliberate. It's a survey we did of what Dublin's reputation is abroad. And in it then we asked people who live in Ireland, who weren't born in Ireland. I call them New Irish. We've got non-national. I don't know the right word anymore, but I think there's 1 in 5 people who live in Dublin weren't born in Dublin. And there's all happy stuff and great stuff about what they want, and they think Dublin is great. Interestingly, obviously they live here, about its great diversity. In every sense of the word, watching the Pride yesterday. And the things they're all worried about are the bit in the bottom, which is all about the infrastructure and the housing, and it's pretty poor at lots of those things. So I make the point, sometimes we put all our problems and our challenges in and saying, God, it's about housing, it's about this and that. And we say, what role would solve all of this? I'm not sure. We need to think very carefully about what role can solve all these problems, and maybe be careful about how much you wish for, in terms of not how much you wish for, but how much you think these might be solved by the person you're talking about. So in conclusion then, no one is in charge of Dublin at the moment, right? There are 4 local authorities, they cooperate, and no one's there to make sure that its deficits are addressed. So in some ways it'd be super to see a directly elected Dublin mayor sitting on top of, or in some other way engaging with the county of Dublin, not to replace local democracy. And there's a whole bunch of debates underneath that, but somebody needs to worry about the airport, where the housing is, where the transport is, and things like that. So not necessarily to replace the existing local authorities, but that's a different debate. The argument I'm making here is about somebody needs to be responsible for Dublin. So I don't do that. I'm not going to debate about that devolution piece. That's a separate decision and a separate debate, if you like, from my perspective. I would very much caution against the introduction of something that's halfway. So I think whatever you do at the end of the day, if you don't get what you want, and you can write what you want in what you're going to propose, but be sure to put a clause in that don't do it in some halfway measure, because that's what happens when you enter into a negotiation. You end up somewhere in the middle, or not really at all, depending on where the power lies. I'd really suggest you put in a caveat about what that might be. Funding, I talked about fear of additional taxation on business. Challenges, I said Dublin's too big, or Ireland's too small. You can have a debate about so much power would be given to a place that has 2/3 of all corporation tax revenue and half of all income tax, and whether you get to keep all of that. So what we've said is, look, if you are going to elect a directly elected mayor, what are the powers? There is actually a metropolitan area strategic plan for Dublin. At the moment, that's done on a regional level, which is even higher. It's the eastern region. Somebody could look at that and be in charge of transport and land use and some of the other powers that are discussed at that regional level. That would be an initial good point to start with. I've met every mayor in London from Ken Livingstone on, except Boris. Boris doesn't leave London because he doesn't want to leave the city. And, you know, it started off small and got bigger. It started off with some powers and got bigger. So it is worth it to make that point. So transport and land use will be a good start, for example. But if you don't get that, and if you don't believe that powers will be devolved at a local level, maybe think about what those powers should be and who should get them. There is a Minister for Rural Affairs at national level, sitting at the Cabinet. Could there be a Minister for Dublin? Could there be a Minister for Urban Affairs? There are 5 cities set out in the national planning framework. Is that a better way to get what you want out of these powers? So not trying to replace local government and local democracy at a very local level in terms of those powers, but in terms of the row about how Dublin works and functions, my suggestion is a directly elected mayor dealing with transport and land use, but if not, maybe something at national level. Thank you.
Avrik, Gurmila Margaret, that was a great presentation, really informative. And we'd now like to welcome from Chambers Ireland, Mr. Shane Keneally, Director of Policy and Communications.
Gurma, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation today. And in particular, thank you to the lay members of the audience here for giving so much of your time to this process. I'm a big fan of the format of the Citizens' Assembly. They've proven to be a very strong tool for having nuanced and complicated conversations. Chambers Ireland, which I'm part of, have a lot of engagement at the European level through Eurochamber. And we're constantly hearing back about the Irish model of citizens' assemblies, and when it comes up, it's spoken of in glowing terms. Personally, I'm going to be treading a careful pathway here today between all the wonderful ideas that I have about the directly elected mayor, as a political nerd, as someone who grew up in Furhouse, as someone who's lived within the canals for the last 10 years. I have lots of my own opinions, but I'm here to communicate the positions of our local chambers. I'm also aware that I'm coming to you at the end of or towards the end of a long process. I'm not going to pretend that I have all the answers for you. At this stage, you guys will be amongst the most expert in the country on this issue. In this presentation, I'll take you through the following elements from the perspective of the broader business community. In a scene setting, explain who Chambers Ireland are, where we think we are with respect to the directly elected mayor. Right now, we'll go through the concerns of our network, what the aspirations for directly elected mayors would be, should they be introduced, and finally, ask you the hard questions which I hope you'll be able to answer in your report. So kind of loosely speaking, we're a grassroots organisation, we're a business organisation, and we are geographically based. What this means is that as a grassroots organisation that spans the business community throughout the island and is in every single major city and town, With a couple of exceptions, our local chambers map onto the local authority areas, though some places like Clare and Mayo tend to have multiple smaller units. In contrast, some of the bigger chambers span a couple of local authority areas, so I'd be thinking of Galway, Cork, Dublin in that space. And Dublin is a special case with 4 chambers in the county. Dublin Chamber is the longest running chamber, but there's also Fingal, South Dublin and Dunleary Rathdown. Just to follow up on kind of Dr. Reedy's observations earlier on, half of all local government spending happens in Dublin each year. It's about 2.3 billion. 720 million of that is funded by the businesses that are in Dublin, so that is local funding. And for all the discussion that happens about LPT, local property tax, every year, I think 47 million was raised in 2020. It is not a significant share of the spending. What happens at local government level is that there is the services they provide for central government locally. There's decisions that councillors make in terms of what services will be put on top of that. There is the decision about how much to tax at the local property level, and then the gap. And that gap is about 30+% of total spending of all kind of grants comes from the businesses that are there on the ground. If there is one particular, as a lobbyist, it's one thing that I'd like you to think about. It's that there's an exemption for government buildings from paying property taxes, and that particularly affects Dublin. So when things happen, like the Bank of Ireland building gets redeveloped on Baggot Street and gets turned into a series of departments, it stops being taxed, and that's revenue that Dublin City Council no longer gets. And given the concentration of government buildings within a lot of Dublin, that actually affects how much can be spent in the county considerably. So again, scene setting, we have about 8,000 business members nationally, another 2,000 plus members which are in the voluntary NGO sector. From the biggest firms in the country to the very smallest, there's a place for every business in our network, and it's a place that marks us out. Our chambers are everywhere, our chambers are geographically focused, and we want to have local healthy economies thriving around the country. That's what puts us into this conversation about directly elected mayors. More than most business organisations, we are the local business organisation. We are the ones that are on the ground. So as grassroots organisations, we come in, so Chambers Ireland comes in whenever there's a consensus across our network. We did not take a view on the plebiscites. Our local chambers took their own positions. Limerick and Cork were in favour. Waterford had mixed views. There was very little political support across the country for the plebiscites to pass. The local authorities themselves pushed back. A lot of the councils were against it. The results were marginal. Our sense is that if there had been a stronger push from the parties earlier, all 3 would have passed. For business at the moment, how do we feel about the prospect of directly elected mayors? Well, there's 3 big problems for businesses right now. There's housing availability for talent and energy costs and security. It is very hard to see how directly elected mayors will tackle those particular problems. From the members that I talked to, there is no consensus that directly elected mayors will solve the problems of the business community. There is a sense that the directly elected mayor is probably a good thing in principle, but there's also the sense that there will be an enormous amount of institutional resistance to them. You'll have had Tim O'Connor into yesterday, and as you'll know, there's a lot of support for a directly elected mayor in Limerick. That comes with a couple of caveats. Limerick wants to see a directly elected mayor which is coupled with local authority reform. Limerick City would appreciate having a responsive directly elected mayor implementing policy locally, and Limerick Chamber supports decentralisation as a principle of the principle of subsidiarity, along with most of our members. Limerick Chamber is very interested in the directly elected mayor having responsibility over transport and infrastructure. However, there's no consensus that what is appropriate for Limerick will be appropriate for everywhere. And that said, there's a general kind of held belief that decision making should be made at the lowest level, at the most effective level, and that would secure kind of local buy-in more easily and help deconflict different policy aims. So, and finally, kind of within that space, kind of across all our chambers, there's the belief that whatever happens with Limerick, the model will be extended across other cities with a slightly tailored version for Dublin. So the meat of our discussion today is the concerns that we have about this role. There's little consensus about what we ought to do, but there's an awful lot of consensus about what the concerns regarding a directly elected mayor are. There's a very strong sense that if what we end up at the end of this process is a largely ceremonial position, some kind of Lord Mayor ++, then this process will have failed. All our chambers acknowledge that there is a risk that these mayors could become, you know, seats of the disaffected, the way our MEP seats can be sometimes. It's possible that, you know, people who are against government might have an easier time in getting elected to a role like the directly elected mayor, but that's one of the risks of democracy. You know, it's an argument against the democratic process. It's not necessarily an argument against directly elected mayors. The meaty problem is of resources and autonomy. If mayors cannot raise money locally, and local authorities have been very, very bad at raising revenue locally, just look at the local property taxes, then the role will be constrained by central government, and the success of the mayors will be decided upon by the ministers sitting in the day. There will likely be tension between mayors and ministers, and conflicts between the departments that don't want to let go of power and resources. So the execution of powers and duties, you know, if there is to be a directly elected mayor for Dublin, will require authority and autonomy. These powers have to be set out explicitly in legislation, or the role will be starved of resources in the event of there being political tension between a government of the day and the mayor of the day. And mayors don't have the capacity, and if mayors don't have the capacity to influence policy like policing, education, transport decisions, there's a very real question as to what the mayor is actually for. If as a mayor your capacity to deliver on your electoral programme for your city is reliant on others facilitating it, then there's a risk that they become a political mudguard to protect actual decision makers. And again, the more cynically minded within the network have suggested that, you know, weak mayors are being proposed as an alternative to real reform at the regional level. So if these are the problems, why are we here? Well, there is support for the idea of directly elected mayors. Primarily, this is because there's seen to be a problem of political accountability when it comes to decision making. Those who like the idea of mayors seem to like it because there will be a focal point for decision making which will be politically accountable to the residents. Our cities and towns are struggling with the very real problems in terms of vacancy, disastrous underinvestment in infrastructure, very poor planning. There's a huge amount of work to be done with public realm and quality of life, but a directly elected mayor would need to have the powers and means to deliver on those objectives. It is thought that there is an opportunity within this process to commence real local government and metropolitan government reform that could remedy these problems that our cities face. And finally, there's also the ambassadorial role for the mayors to help channel investment, to help channel jobs into local areas, though that wouldn't be enough to justify the role. The role needs to have real executive decision-making authority. So my questions for you. Most people in our network seem to think that there's an issue with democratic accountability and decision-making through our government. The principal question is that if the problem is democratic unaccountability, is a directly elected mayor the right way to solve this? There's a great line from Yes Prime Minister about, it's called the politician's syllogism. You know, when you encounter a problem, you know, we must do something. This is something. Therefore, we must do this. And it has to be asked about the directly elected mayor. There's a risk that if the alternative to a directly elected mayor is doing nothing, we'll just go down the path of a directly elected mayor, even if there's better, more appropriate solutions. And again, the cynical within the network have suggested that we are treading down this path to avoid introducing real reforms across all levels of government. The second problem is subsidiarity. The challenge of finding the right level of decision making for Dublin is a real question. The real question is what subsidiarity would look like within a metropolitan area with multiple local governments, and how do we deliver that? As it is, we have local area committees that discuss very local problems at the ward level, as it once was called. But resolving those problems currently requires the chief executive to take action. As is, the councillors have very little real power to resolve the problems that they discuss and determine. Would introducing another level of authority above them again undermine local decision making even more? Perhaps reintroduction of town councils would be useful in lieu of or in combination with the directly elected mayors. And finally, the big question is, how do we finance the role without the success of the mayor being dependent on their relationship with government? Can they be given the autonomy and the resources they need to avoid being mere figureheads? So these are not easy questions, and thank you so much for taking so much of your time to consider them and how they can be addressed. And I'd have to concur with what Averick said. If you're considering compromising, don't. Go big. Gurma.
Thanks, Shane, for that presentation. Loud and clear. I think they're going to go big. That's my sense of them. That's for sure. From last time, anyway, they were going big. So we are now going to break for a private session for a roundtable discussion. Please come back to me for those online at 10:50 a.m. That's in approximately about 20 minutes' time. So we'll see you all back then at 10:50, and then we conduct the Q&A, and then followed by coffee. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to those who are joining us online for our Q&A session with our two speakers, Mr. Averick McGibney, Director of Public and International Affairs at the Dublin Chamber of Commerce, and also with us this morning is Mr. Shane Keneally, Director of Policy and Communications at Chamber Ireland. So we have a 15-minute Q&A with our two guest speakers, and we will open the questions up to the floor, please. First up, table 4, and then table 1 and 12.
Hi. Question from table 4 with regards to the nighttime economy in Dublin. I suppose considering the current market, and there's been previous talks about the nighttime economy potentially being a devolved power and a potential revenue raising aspect. Do you have any suggestions as to how this might work, and would there be severe backlash from that industry if it was talked about further?
Do we do it one at a time? Sorry, Chair.
The way we can run it is if there's just one speaker would be great, but if you both want to answer the questions, that's also appropriate.
Okay, I can start with that. I'm going to leave all the hard questions to Shane, obviously, because that's how we've agreed it in advance. So so yeah, there's a report. There was a committee that looked at the nighttime economy, and it has very particular issues about. It's a standard type of thing that, you know, public transport brings everybody into town, because I heard in your earlier debates about, I call it town, right? But then there's no taxis to get you home. And you know, it will be, so there's a good reason to coordinate policy around that area, and there's lots of other issues. So to be honest, the biggest issues I'm hearing, even before nighttime, is safety and security, actually, increasingly so. In terms of behavioural norms, because post-COVID, you have less people in the city centre, in particular, in town, and you have challenges around, you know, about how people feel safe and secure in the city. So I think that's a particular issue. So yeah, look, having an advocate for that would be useful. Would I recommend, you know, businesses would argue, even those that pay it that are in the nighttime economy would say, where do all our rates go? Okay, they get a bill, they don't really see where that money is spent, and as I tried to point out, there's a lot of other money that comes in and comes out and is earmarked. So companies don't really see the money that their rates go to. It isn't. They don't get a note afterwards saying this is going on your street or whatever. That's not explained to them. And arguably, with the transfer of funds that go from commercial rates to other counties, Dublin is actually supporting lots of other counties as well. So if the caveat I'd put would be transparency about where the money goes. And also, I think if we're being meaningful about giving more powers to, at a local level, you know, and this is another debate, I mean, it's easy enough to tax companies, but the evidence we have about how councillors choose to tax citizens in terms of, say, the property tax in general, and I make no disrespect to councillors, because there's an argument about this, because if you cut the property tax, it's a logical thing, because if you raise it, if you keep it at the top level for that decision about local property tax, the 15% for people who know what you're talking about, government will just take it off you anyway. So there's a view that no matter how much money you raise locally, it'll be cut off at the other end by central government, so you don't get any more money.
Okay, sorry, just to come in there. Is the speaker working? There we go. I suppose, like, as Averick mentioned, one of the critical issues is around transport. I'm in a slightly difficult situation because I speak with Chambers Ireland hat on, so we wouldn't get too finely into the detail of what happens in Dublin. But like, one of the key elements is transport. You know, we did a lot of work on the In Her Shoes project that the transport came on, where they were bringing in kind of a gender focus on the transport sector more generally. So if you're somebody who is, you know, trying to use public transport system to come home, particularly this would be a big issue for workers within the nighttime economy. You know, it can be very difficult and very unsafe to go home, so you're getting taxis instead, and there's a lot of insecurities associated even with a taxi. So there's a lot of work that is there that needs to get done. I think it would be useful to have that kind of a somebody who could remind the system that they're supposed to be responsive to citizens, and I think that's what the great benefit of a directly elected mayor would be. But you'd also have to consider, the fact that, it's the Department of Justice that decides the rules regarding licensing. So, there would need to be some kind of a transfer of power if you wanted to have a Dublin-orientated kind of nighttime economy where, you could have clubs open like in Berlin until ever, they'll always be open. But that's not going to happen unless departments are willing to let go of those powers. I think that will be the big challenge for you guys. It's not that, of course, any hypothetical mayor can do whatever it wants, but someone has to grant them that power. And that's where you guys come into this one. It's, be ambitious for your city. I love Dublin. I love being in Dublin. I have great crack here. But, it's not the city it was 20 years ago. And there's reasons for that. And, the aspiration for many of our chambers are that, those problems will be fixed if there was more democratic accountability. So,
okay, thank you. So thanks Shane and Avric for that. So table 3, then 12, 175. Table 3, please.
As Jared from table 3. Our question goes to Shane. Shane, in your presentation, you mentioned on a couple of occasions the principle of subsidiarity. Now, our table's understanding of that principle is that no higher authority, legitimate higher authority, has the right to subsume the entrusted power and authority to a lesser democratic authority. Number one, is our assumption of that principle correct? And two, given that everybody is answerable to somebody, that the directly elected mayor must in fact answer to a higher authority, is this not a double-edged sword?
Okay, so my understanding of subsidiarity is a bit more nuanced insofar as it's the decision being made at the right level for that particular area of policy. So, if, I can recall a situation kind of out in Fairhouse where the Department of Education had decided that there was going to be 2 new schools being built, and they decided it was going to be within a particular triangle of land, and no other site could be considered. Now, there was another site which had gone vacant 15 years earlier, which was on the edge of that triangle. It was literally the far side of the road. And it was excluded from consideration because somebody on Marlborough Street had made a decision about where it ought to be, That read to me like decisions were happening at the wrong level. That if somebody knew the area better, they would understand that actually there's a great building here, it's a great site there, it's lying vacant for years. The Scientologists are in there now. It's not an ideal situation where we've gotten to. But it was happening at a remove. Now, if you were to consider a different policy area, for example, transport, that's something that probably has to happen at the metropolitan area, or even kind of a level up again where you look at the greater Dublin area, you look at the county surrounding it and try to work together. How do we get, projects which are worth tens of billions, if we were to get the metro from from Sandyford to here, those kinds of things need to happen at a much higher level. And subsidiarity is really about figuring out what level is the appropriate level for a particular decision to get made, for the best decision to get made. People talk a lot about efficiency, but effectiveness is also important, getting the decision made well. And again, this is a question I'm going to push back to you guys, because certain things are, ought to be done at that level. Like if you take the licensing law issues, that's probably not something that should be taken at a national level, because the pub opening times in where my father is in Gortin, Galway, need not be the same as they are where I live, which is just off Smithfield. It makes no sense that we have a flat rule across that, and there should be a lot more kind of local autonomy when it comes to making those kinds of decisions.
Thanks, Table, for that question. We have with us this morning, as always, our expert advisory group, our EAG, We've got Professor Derek O'Brien and Dr. Breed Quinn. So maybe because one of the can we bring a mic down, please, to the EAG, and might just give us a quick maybe line or two on subsidiarity. Thank you. And thanks for putting me on the spot.
Yeah, thank you, Chairperson, for a Sunday morning. But yes, subsidiarity as a principle was originally mentioned, or in its most famous mentioning, was in a papal encyclical about social justice and so on, Rerum Novarum, back in the 1930s. But its more common usage spread particularly through the EU in the 1990s, because in one of the treaties, one of the articles was about subsidiarity. But it's actually the interpretation that I came to from the end of a lot of research on it is this idea of making decisions at the most appropriate level. It's not necessarily the lowest level. Sometimes, as Shane has just said, decisions need to be made at local level, but other decisions need to be made at a higher level. And subsidiarity accommodates that. So therefore, it's working out what is the most appropriate level for a decision to be made. So it's not that power must always be devolved, and in certain systems of politics, where there's a lot of decision making at local level, like the Scandinavian ones, there is the idea of passing up, as part of subsidiarity, actually giving certain decisions to be made at a higher level. So you have those variations. Derek?
I can't follow that. That's the perfect answer.
Dr. Quinn, Gurneil Margaret.
Would you put that in writing, please?
So we now have table 12, 1, 7 and 5. Table 12, please.
Hi, my name is Susanna from Table 12. You mentioned that 60% of the, oh God, I'm going blank now, corporation tax is generated in Dublin. And I was wondering if the Chambers would be in favour of either a levy on that or a small cut of that going to the local area, local authority in Dublin. Is that something that the Chambers would be in favour of or not? And maybe then just a comment, our previous speaker talked about deliberative budgeting. And, it sounds like you have some questions about where the rates are being spent, and maybe that's a process that we could think about that you could get involved in as well.
I'm not familiar with the deliberative budgeting piece, so maybe if you just explain that to me for a second. Apologies.
Sure. So the deliberative budgeting, I mean, Shoni mentioned it briefly, but I've heard about it before. It's being used in Brazil. So what happens is, at the local authority area, they have a pot of money, and they get a number of stakeholders around the table, which are just, citizens, businesses, and they say, where do you want this money spent? What is the most important thing for you in the community? Where do you want this money to go? And people debate it out and they vote.
Okay, thank you. So just, I can start, but in relation to corporation tax, there's an argument around that, which is around how competitive we are internationally. One of the central tenets of Ireland's investment strategy is to have a single low rate. So any changes to that become tied up with a much bigger debate. In terms of allocation, right, so taking a piece of that and giving it an earmarking in a particular way, I observe that very little national tax revenue, any of it, is earmarked in any specific way. Okay, politicians don't like it at national level, because if, God forbid, if the money from smoking all went, towards health, or car, petrol and VRT all went to roads and whatever, because it gives them fungibility in terms of allocations or whatever. So you don't really see that very much, and the Department of Finance, I've observed, rarely like to earmark particular pieces of taxation for other things. In relation to the deliberative budgeting point, It kind of depends on how much money you have, really, is the other side of that question, because it would be nice to have people together. And there are structures, there are strategic policy committees that at a local level, businesses tend to have representation on, where they get to kind of comment and observe and whatever. And I wouldn't say we're not consulted and have a good relationship with the local authorities we deal with, but you know, it's all about the size of that pot, isn't it? And it's sort of people's reluctance then, it's about who's willing to pay extra to fill up that pot. If I can just come back just to the accountable, the Gerard's question just for 1 second. I just observe again that Dublin's population is 1.45 million people against an overall population of 5 million. So second only to the President, if you have a directly elected mayor that's accountable to 1.45 million people. And this question about subsidiarity is really important about the appropriate level, because I remember, I think it was Harney's time in terms of healthcare, where you began to centralise healthcare in terms of cancer care. If I have cancer, I want to be treated by a doctor who deals with cancer all day long, day in and day out. If I'm treated by a surgeon dealing with cancer, I want to have somebody who does that day in, day out. There's no point having a local person who deals with cancer if they're not doing it all the time, if they're doing other functions as well. So there's a certain, the maths around that, about what's the right level if you, in terms of having an expert. And that's true of lots of other things as well.
Thanks for that question from table 12. Just it's a participatory budgeting, and South Dublin County Council actually run that process. I live in that area, that local authority, and I've seen it pop in the post box about where we want our money spent, and on some very high level areas, but it does take place. It's a very interesting concept. So we now go on to table 1, 7 and 5. Thank you.
Hi, Stephen here, table 1. Our question was, maybe you could speak to the experience of similar business groups with directly elected mayors in other cities. I know, Averick, you mentioned London, and particularly around the sort of concerns that you've raised.
Ooh, that's a good question. The first thing I'd say is that mayors in other countries, and I know you've seen Manchester, but you also had Paris, I think, and others, they start from a different place. So I always think we've had, after their job, we've had some of the New York mayors, for example, and there's the police and the education, and you know, every movie you've ever seen about a mayor and the influence over the policing system. So it's about how much local government they have to start with. I think in London, for example, London Chamber of Commerce are supportive, and they, you know, the structure there, where there's an overall mayor and that still that local government structure, the city councils or boroughs or whatever are also still operating, has proved arguably quite successful for London. But London has a very different population, and even then that population is still a small part. I mean, I don't know, what is it, 8 million, 10 million? It's still a small part of the UK overall. So that's one of the challenges I posed, which is the 8 to the 10. But yeah, in London Chamber, for example, I think they're supportive of it. But, and, you know, in terms of being a voice for the city, they found it quite useful. So yeah, look, I mean, you do find businesses wanting, if it works well, it's great. It's like that. If it doesn't work, then they don't like it.
Okay, we've got 4 minutes left, so we're going to go to table 7 and 5. So if the presenters can keep that time frame as well in mind. Thank you.
Hi, it's Mohammed from table 7. What do you think about the contradiction between the needs of small businesses and the needs of people for housing? I just give an example, like if Shop in Fairview were closed down because of cycling track recently.
I might come in there briefly then. I don't think there is a contradiction between the two. I mean, if you look at our commercial vacancy rates in Dublin, it's up and around about 15% for commercial properties. You know, if we were in Denmark, it would start being a crisis at about 5%. There's a huge amount of above the shop vacancy that happens in Dublin. You know, I live in the city centre. I see it all of the time. There's a huge amount of underutilised, underused and vacant properties that aren't really represented in the official statistics, but they are present. We all know that they're there. You know, I live a very short walk away from Bolton Street. You have long stretches of buildings there, you know, where people could be living, and these places have been vacant for, my lifetime, never mind, the building's lifetime itself. So there isn't an issue with a lack of property and businesses in the city. There's just a lack of usable properties, and most cities manage to complement having commercial properties with associated residential buildings as well.
Just quickly, one of the main problems of getting City Edge off the ground, which is the brownfield outside of Bluebell I mentioned earlier on, is sewerage, is investment in infrastructure and sewerage to accommodate the housing that might be needed. So it's for housing. I mean, housing is the biggest concern of businesses in Dublin. And the problems are the infrastructure to support it and the actual building of it.
Thank you. And the last question then from table 5.
Thanks. Hi, Shiva from Table 5. This has been answered in some ways, but just a little bit more. Where do you think that businesses would like to see money spent in terms of the commercial rates already raised, and also in terms of potential tax increases and making them a bit more palatable? Thank you.
So overall, businesses would rather see more investment in infrastructure. So we would argue at a national level that the proportion of money spent on capital spending should be retained and increased. And not just now in the current year when you've got inflation and wood is twice the price or whatever, but sustaining that. We've a habit in recession and downturn to maintain current spending and not invest in capital spending. So the water problem that Dublin has is not a water problem of now, it's a water problem of 20 or 30 years. The same is true for some of the other pieces of infrastructure that Dublin needs, and the same is true of housing. When we were building 90,000 homes in the 90s, we were building 10,000 in Dublin. We were building loads of houses, but not in the right place. In terms of how much, look, turkeys don't vote for Christmas and businesses don't vote for huge increases in taxes. I think transparency is definitely a huge issue. And, it's about what the purpose and earmarking it and what it's for. Commercial rates aren't the only tax that businesses pay. They pay other charges. If you're a restaurant, you have other kind of grease taxes and other things as well, and charges for the stuff you have outside your premises. So there's sort of a reliance at local level in the current structure on business taxation. And the real nettle to be grasped is actually how much are people prepared to pay more for the area that they live in.
And the thing that I kind of come in on there is again, to bring it back to the vacancies, those properties which are lying vacant, they're not producing LPT, they're not producing commercial rates, they're a cost on their communities directly, but they're also a cost on the local authority, because they are places where there is vandalism, there is like dumping, all those issues occur, and they cost their society. So we'd argue that those vacancies, those kind of underutilized areas, should be taxed much higher to incentivize their use, and that would also broaden the tax base. The best way to bring in more taxes is to have more growth.
Thank you so much, for Table 5, for that question and for the answers. What we have on the slide there on the screen is the process that's taking place currently in South County Dublin. So well done to that local authority for engaging in that budgetary process. So that concludes our session this morning on the view from the business community. And could we give a warm Dublin Assembly members, Gurmila Margaret, to Mr. Averick McGibney from Dublin Chamber of Commerce and Mr. Shane Keneally from Chambers Ireland. Gurmila Margaret. So we're on a break now for coffee. We'll be back, please, in your seats for 11:30. Thank you very much. Okay, if we could please join our seats, please. We're not going live with this session. It's a private session, so just take our seats, please. Thank you. So facilitators, over to you now, please, to move into this. What have you learned so far? Thank you.